into existence a people that he could regard as precious to begin with. What was the motive before there was a people to love? And verse 7 gives that answer. He says, everyone who is called by my name and whom I have created for my glory, when I have formed, even whom I have made. God created Israel for his glory, just in the same that we too were created for his glory. So this is God's goal from the beginning. So in one sense, we can speak of the exodus out of Egypt as the birth of Israel as a nation. At this point, God has given Israel the law to regulate life as a nation. We know it as the Ten Commandments, and it goes forth from there. It's the backbone of the nation ever since that time. But the call of Abraham, back in Genesis chapter 12, must ultimately be the conception of the nation of Israel. This is where we see the son of Jacob come through, the son Jacob come through, and from him a lineage that becomes the 12 tribes, which is known as Israel. When we see this, that period of the patriarchs, the slavery in Egypt, it would have ultimately been the development period of Israel as a nation. God had created Israel for his glory. And what this means is that God is at every step in this process from the beginning to see them through. So if this is ultimately true, then there's a key phrase that we see kind of penetrate through all of history. And I mentioned just a moment ago the Tower of Babel coming in. And in Genesis chapter 11, we see the Tower of Babel. And if you can think back quite a few months now that we spent a couple of weeks in this time and season, there's a key phrase that comes about. And Genesis 11, chapter 11, verse 4, we see, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its tops in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves." So ever since Adam and Eve had chosen to eat from the forbidden tree in order to be like God, independent of him and wise in their own right, the human people has sought to be ultimately independent of themselves. Because of this, they've been enslaved to a rebellious heart that hates to rely on God, but loves to make a name for itself. And the Tower of Babel was that in fullness. Let us build a tower for ourselves so that we can make a name for ourselves. It was no longer about glorifying God. It was about glorifying ourselves. We do this every day when we deliberately choose to make a name for ourselves. We do it intentionally. I had a conversation with Elizabeth just on the way here, and I said, I love my little vices. I love the little things because it makes me feel like I can be in control. And that's the ultimate reason. It makes me feel like I can be in control. And the reality is, time and time again, they will control you. It's just the way it is. But when we set forth in a destiny mindset that I want to be something significant, and the entire time God's saying, listen, you are going to be something significant if you just look towards me. Let me make you something significant. Because if you rely on yourself to do it, you're not going to make it. With the Tower of Babel, it's this booming illustration of God starting a new thing. And we see that in chapter 12, because instead of abandoning the human race, God starts this new thing. He chooses Abram. He makes him the promise that second covenant promise that we have. And this is what he says in contrast to what the towers to what the builders of the Tower of Babel said. In Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great." So the people working on the Tower of Babel said, "Let us make a name for ourselves." But then God chooses the father of the Jewish nation, and he says, "I will make your name great." So what does this ultimately show us about the goal of God in the world and his created? Because when ancient man refused to align himself with the goal of God, God set about a very different way of achieving that exact goal. Man was made to rely on God and give him glory. Instead, man chose to rely on himself and seek his own, so that he could make a name for himself. So God elected one small, minuscule person, and he gave him a promise to achieve God's purpose through that individual and ultimately his descendants. You know, we've seen at this point in our timeline that God has made Abraham's name great, that he has made that name into a nation, which is Israel. And we see all of this from the beginning. And what is the goal of all of this? I have to mind you, from our creation, man was created from the beginning in God's image so that he could be the image bearer of God. If God had no image and we were created in his image to be his image, it's a uniqueness. To multiply, to fill the earth so that the knowledge of the glory of God could cover even to the sea and beyond. And ever since the fall of Adam and Eve, and ever since man becoming inherited with sin, people have refused to align themselves with his divine goal. But all of God's acts through human history and what we have represented have been aimed at seeing his purpose through. So it's not just about Israel. It's not just about this nation for us this morning. But it's about all of us whom God has created for his glory. And that's why the New Testament, again and again, calls us to do all things to the glory of God. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, let your light so shine among men that they may see your good deeds and give glory to your Father in heaven. You know, this isn't about us doing God a favor. It's a command to align our lives with his eternal goal. He has created us for his glory. And in light of that, we aim to create and govern the world that he is glorified in. He says, I've created you for my glory. I formed you. I made you. And in light of that, we represent him before the world, giving him the glory for what he's done through us. It all goes back to him. It's not a selfishness. It's not a pride. It's not about what we can do. It's about focusing the glory to where it belongs. The glory of God, it's a beautiful thing, and it's an excellence of his manifold perfections. And we try to attempt to put these things into words, but it's better to be seen in pictures and images. A professional athlete performing to their most greatest ability, that's a beautiful thing. To see a sunset from the mountaintop, out in flat rock, out wherever you might be around here, you can see beautiful sunsets and see the beauty of God. You can, as I mentioned, any sporting event to where a professional performs at their utmost ability.